everyone to Unit 3. This is Susi Moser, and we are continuing our course in climate change communication. It's wonderful to have you back and to keep engaging in this exploration of how to be more effective in talking about climate change. Today is an exciting unit for me. It's the center of our conversation, and I hope you'll take a lot away from it. To get started, let's do this again like we did last time to just quickly look at the course goals that we have. We have spent a bit of time now on the basic components of impactful climate change communication and how to tailor your communication to a particular audience. So that's what you focused on particularly last time. This time it is really about the how. How do we deliver these key messages in a way that is really impactful? And to do that, we're going to spend a good number of time today thinking about the emotions, the values, the identity that we bring to climate change communication and that we want to tap into to make it more powerful and passionate and resonant with the audience. As we did last time, I also want to quickly orient you in sort of where we are. I just said we are sort of in the center of our training right now. And for me, this is kind of appropriate because this whole piece around the emotions, thinking about how to elevate motivations and barriers and limit or reduce the barriers to action, to me, that is really at the heart of what we need to do. It's not only what we say and to whom we say it, but how do we do that in a way that just really gets them off their seats and does, really motivate them and engage them. And then, in the latter part of this, in the next 2 units, we will think more about, well, by what channels and, in what form do we communicate, who should communicate. And then, as you will see again and again, just like we've done so far, that every step of the way, there is sort of a way in which we have to iterate in our communication strategy to keep refining it, to making it more succinct, more effective, more with every step that we learn about the audience and learning about these aspects that we're talking about today. So that's what we're going to do in coming units, but today is really that center, the focus on the central part here of motivations and barriers and psychological issues that affect our communication. A quick review, just for those of you who, have maybe already completed Unit 2 a while back and you can't remember all of it. The key issues there that we try to get across had to do with the first rule of effective communication, which is all about the audience. If you do not know who you're talking to, it is just throwing darts and in the dark. You may be lucky and hit something, but it is much less likely to be effective if you don't really understand your audience at a deeper level. And you all realized how challenging that sometimes can be. We practiced a little bit around how to segment our audiences, how to identify it, to look at some of the deeper underlying demographic, geographic, sectoral, professional, political, ideological, cultural attitudes that people might bring to an issue like climate change. And you practice then doing that with a particular audience and in an iterative process looked at, well, what do you want to achieve with them? What's your actual goal and how does that need to be refined as you move forward? We spent a good deal of time looking at framing, what makes good frames, mental models, and messages. And the framing maybe is the most challenging thing, and yet it in some ways is maybe the most foundational of all of these things. The framing is kind of how do you get your foot in the door? How do you make something resonant and relevant to someone? How do you speak in a language that actually connects with something that they care about, their interests, their worries, their concerns, the things they have on their daily minds? How can you get your issue connected to their way of thinking? That's what framing does. So that's what we did. And now we're going to, and you did that, using a number of exercises to explore that. And, I understand it took you quite a bit of time. It is actually the most important step. If you spend the time on this piece, a lot of the rest of what follows in your communication will come much more easily and quickly. And I want to emphasize again, in some ways, if you don't spend the time here, why bother spending time on the rest? Because it's unlikely to be as effective and it's just a waste of time. So the time spent on understanding the audience and how to frame things and what you want to say to them is really, really important if you want to actually get through to them. So let's then dive into this question of how to elevate the motivation to make a change and minimizing the barriers or resistance we might experience in getting there. And that takes us really centrally to the question of emotions, values, and identities that people bring to an issue. You've seen this graphic here a number of times now, where we spent the first couple of units on this issue of linking our communication with a particular goal, right? And today we're going to focus on this middle piece, which in some ways is, the most important connectors. If you do not achieve a higher motivation to change, well, why should anybody get off the couch, right? Why should they not just do whatever they do already? And if you don't limit or reduce the barriers to actually making that change, then they might be very motivated, but get super frustrated that they can't make it happen. So it's those two things that need to come into a kind of a balance so that people actually succeed with their efforts to try to do something different, which is what you're asking them. What I want to do in this unit is to actually start out by reminding us of the size of the task before us. You're going to hear some things that Daniel Etengo already talked about in his lectures in Unit 1. I'm going to give it my own try of how to communicate climate change to you in a way that hopefully motivates you to look at the emotions. I guess that's the point of this. And then we're going to spend the whole rest of the unit on understanding what is that human element that we need to take care of. And I guess the argument I want to make is that if you ignore the emotions, it's much more likely that you will essentially see little response, not an effective response, possibly resistance, and your communication effort will fail. So we're going to look at what that means for doing our own emotional work, dealing with the emotions of others and their defensiveness around making a change. We're going to look at hope and how to elevate motivations, and then take a look also at how to minimize barriers. And as I said before, all of that will make you think again and again and again about, do I have the right audience? Do I have the right goal? And I want to say, don't despair. This is part of building a strategy that actually works. I mean, the whole point of strategy is that you are strategic, that you're really lining up everything you do with a particular goal. So this is the hard work of communication, to actually make every piece of your communication align so that it achieves the goal that you have in mind. So that's what we're diving into. Let's start with this. The transformation imperative or transformative imperative, which in my mind begins by getting really real about how big of a change is it that we actually need to make. Many of you have spoken to efforts that are going on already in Seychelles, and in many ways this is the kinds of changes many of us have been making all over the world, a little bit of change here, a little bit of change there, and yet I think what's coming is a lot bigger. Here's why I think that. Daniel mentioned the Paris Accord and the goal of trying to stay below 2 degrees centigrade of warming above pre-industrial levels. Now that doesn't sound like much. Of course, many have argued that it would be even better if we stayed underneath 1.5 degrees. And that is a report that the IPCC just released a couple of years ago. I strongly urge you to look at that. It's a very serious document. But what would it mean to try to actually achieve that? In my mind, it requires a complete blood transfusion, if you will, of modern society. And what I mean by that is that we currently are fueled by these polluting fossil fuels to power everything we do, everything. And so in order to change that to a clean fuel, to renewables, we have to essentially get rid of all that old fuel, all that old blood in our system. And that means a fundamental restructuring of the globalized economy, profound changes in people's consumption thinking, their behaviors. In order to get there, we need extraordinarily well-functioning institutions at the local level, at the state, at the national level, at the international level. And even if we do all of that, the warming that 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees involves, that still means we have to do quite a bit of adaptation. It's manageable, and we have maybe more time if we stay at that level, but still we need to do that as well. So now what if we completely miss that? What if we go with business as usual, as we seem to be doing in large parts of the world, and we warm more than 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees, which is all possible? What that means is that we're going to get extensive, rapid climate changes and a growing number of really outrageous catastrophes, which will result in global shifts in markets and where we produce things, because it's simply no longer possible or safe. We will see massive numbers of people migrating all over the world from unsafe places to relatively safer places. We will still make attempts to adapt to all of those changes, although whether or not we succeed is a whole other question when things are constantly disrupted. And there's both the unpredictable consequences of climate change that we don't entirely know of, and the unpredictable consequences of our adaptation efforts in all these areas and sectors of society. So to me, that looks just as much like a world in transformation. And then there's the possibility we stay somewhere around 2 to 3 degrees. And let's see what that means. Well, we will still get more extensive climate changes and catastrophes, more than in that first scenario that I gave you. We will obviously make massive emission reduction efforts and try to adapt. And I'm almost convinced that we're also going to see geoengineering, because people tend to not stand by when things get really uncomfortable. They will try to intervene and try to fix it with whatever ways they have. So, that's a whole other level of intervening in the climate system that we don't even know at the moment. So it's quite likely we're producing unpredictable changes, unknowable changes at this point. And even so, with all of this that we're needing to do, it will require, or produce, if you will, an unprecedented political, legal, financial, military complexity like we have never dealt with. So every single one of these possible worlds that I just painted to you, to me, sounds like a very, very different one than the one we're used to right now. So I don't see a future that doesn't involve transformation. It's only a choice between a transformation we choose, like in that first scenario, or a transformation that is imposed on us in the second and third scenarios. And you might say, well, wait a minute, look at this. It's so beautiful. It's just not even close. You can't even imagine that. Well, let me try to make my case a little bit stronger. This is all the things you do, that we do, that the world is doing all over. It's, wonderful efforts. Every single one of them counts, because it begins to establish a social norm of doing things differently in a new way. And it's making the argument that some of this actually creates jobs and different type of economy. It's not the end of all things. It's a very different kind of thing. So there are good things going on. And the same is true in the adaptation arena, right? Here, this is all images from your neck of the woods, essentially, of people doing something already to deal with things. So it's not like we're just standing by, right? So good signs. And internationally, we're doing things. We have from COP21 in 2015, we have the Paris Agreement that I just mentioned, and that is something. And I want to show you where we are. So the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and this is where we are. After we finally got an international agreement on climate change, our emissions have only gone up. Now, this ends here, this particular graphic, in 2018. We're now in 2020, and we have a global collapse of economic activity through the pandemic. And of course, there will be a dip. Just if you take your eyes just a few years earlier to that little dip just over that 30 line that you see there, that was the global economic crisis in 27, 28. That was a recession that we all felt and suffered from. And I'm sure this one that we're in right now is producing another dip in the emissions, but it's hard to deny the overall trend, right? So despite that agreement, we have not yet fully implemented it and achieved what it actually said. I want to put that in perspective for you. What you see here are, on the left-hand side, our historical emissions, and then the sort of faint colors are different trajectories that the emissions need to take in order to achieve particular temperature goals. So the green line is that, emissions trajectory with getting to 1.5 degrees. The yellow one, that is that 2-degree line. What you see next are the pledges and targets and current policies that are in place as we speak. And at the most optimistic level, it's almost 2.8, 3 degrees with what we currently have. And if we don't do more than that, if we just basically keep going with business as usual, and you see some signs of that at the moment, even we're, at least here in the United States, we're relaxing our emission reduction policies under this current administration. So that's really aiming at 4 degrees, 4.8 degrees of warming. Now, I just want you to know that there are studies that exist that basically say above 4 degrees of warming, it is likely impossible to have a civilized society still on this planet. So, these numbers hide the fact that they really, they symbolize a world that is completely different than the ones that we're used to. Now, the current policies are where you see it, and where we need to get to is that 2 degrees. And in order to get there, here is 2020, we're already past the time when the curve should have turned to get to that. Where we are instead is, in this sort of territory here of being well above where we should be, and we need to bring emissions down by a radical amount, more than 50% by 2030, and by 100% essentially by 2050. So this is what I'm saying about, the transformation that is required to get to 2 degrees of warming, or 1.5. I like this quote here from a journalist named David Roberts, who gave a TED Talk in 2012 where he said, "This is where we are, stuck between the impossible and the unthinkable." And then he continued, "And so for the rest of your life, your job is to make the impossible possible." You had someone on the continent who said this about the impossible: "It always seems impossible until it's done." And I guess Nelson Mandela has a lot of credibility to speak about that. To make the impossible possible, that is what we need to achieve. The most ambitious proposals that are out there in different policy packages here in the United States, we call it the Green New Deal. In Europe, there is a European Green New Deal. And, there are similar things in other parts of the world. But basically, they say net zero greenhouse gas emissions by middle of the century, millions of good high-wage jobs, investing in a whole different type of infrastructure, green, clean infrastructure, and a sustainable environment for all. Of course, that links up with the sustainability goals, and doing all that in a way that actually doesn't only meet the environmental and climate goals, but is also just and equitable for people, both within any country and across the world between developed and developing countries. You can see how unbelievably ambitious that is. The American climate movement leader Bill McKibben said, it's a chance to remake not just a broken planet, but a broken society. I think that's really important, and an opportunity to think about, are our climate change efforts not something that we can link with making things better on a lot of grounds for a lot of people in a lot of places that are already not all that great. So you already are working on the technical task. You in your work, you do this on a daily basis to assess the risks, to plan for what you want to do and implement those actions and engage your stakeholders in that. Of course, part of that is, why you're in this course, right? You want to do that more effectively. But I want to convey to you that that level of change that we were just talking about, that actually involves at its core a human task, which is meeting people in their fears and worries about both what could be, but also about losing what they have. It's reaching people behind their defenses against any kind of change. We're creatures of habit. We want to keep doing things the way we know that they're being done, what we've always done. And how do you get people to engage constructively with that change? So that means, tapping into their interests, into their needs, but also into their desire for hope, and engaging them constructively in creating a good future, as opposed to just coping with a bad future they have no control over. And very often that means that they have to change, the people we speak to have to change and face a transformation, and we ourselves. Why? Because what we're doing has not worked, has not done enough to prevent us from being in this place in the first place. We too will not be bystanders. We too will have to transform our jobs. I mean, this current example with the COVID crisis is such a good example of all of a sudden we're being asked to completely adapt how we do what we have to do. And in some ways, it's practice. This is a good example of the kind of change that we need to do. And I want to say we've been amazingly responsive and creative in this crisis in making that happen. It's exhausting like crazy. Everyone, has too much on their plates now and juggles family and job at the same time. So something has to give, something has to change on a very profound level, but we will not stand outside of that. We will be in this world that is transforming, and we will have to transform ourselves. So this is what brings me to, we have to deal with the emotions, because think about the size of the change I just mentioned. What fears does that bring up for you? What grief, despair, hope? What's in it for you? I've heard it in some of your comments in our first Zoom call, where people, looked outside their windows and really felt what it was like to be this close to the impacts of climate change. So just think that that's also happening to the people that you're trying to reach. They might worry. They might be in grief, especially after a disaster, or if they're losing something that they really value in the landscape, the reefs, you name it. You might encounter anger and defiance, and that could be about climate change, and that could be about what you want them to do about it. They might be just as angry about the solution as they might be about the actual reason behind it. When you have traumatic events, you have people who are in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You have people in fear and anxiety, can take on really significant proportions in this country and in Australia and in many other parts of the world where this is already an important, or part of their experience now. This is something that a lot of psychologists are all of a sudden facing. They never had people have come in the office because of environmental trauma, and now they do. In some instances, people might be in true despair. These are images from the US. I can imagine that you can think of many other places, whether it's in small island states or any other part of the world that you have seen images of, where people are losing their livelihoods, they're losing their homes, the places where they buried their ancestors. Those are just bearing time. In Australia, during the excessive drought that they had a few years back, the rates of suicide just went through the roof. This is real. This is not just I'm making this up out of nowhere. In other cases, you find people turn their experience, their emotional experience, into a kind of determination to fight for change that is inspiring, if you will, and admirable. Sometimes it becomes fun and joyful and creative in how people turn their outrage into action that gets people's attention. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there are very diverse emotional responses to climate change. It's not just one thing. This is a list from an article that I cite here at the bottom of all the emotions people discovered when they asked Americans about it. I've seen articles like this from nearly every part of the world. Powerlessness stands out often. And you can see that, here what I highlight in red, these are the what we might call dark or negative emotions, but they're not the only thing. I mean, look at this here, the things that show up in blue. There are things that you can tap into. Worry being maybe you might consider a negative emotion, but what I mean by that is really you worry about something when you're afraid that you lose something that you love. It's always that deeper feeling behind it, right? That motivates us. Some people are just curious and interested in it. They have courage or joy even. So do not assume you're only encountering one flavor of emotion. It's a really important thing to sort of make room for both and work with both types. I showed you this in the first unit here of some of the changes in over time in people's emotional responses, but also in just that there are really a diversity of emotions that have been studied extensively here in the U.S. They also vary across the different types of audiences. Remember the 6 Americas I introduced you to, from the most alarmed all the way to the dismissive? Well, here you can see, just around the level of worry. Well, the alarmed are very, very worried, whereas the dismissive, like, what? I'm not worried. It's just not even on their radar screen, right? So you have to really think that through for the kinds of audiences that you have chosen. What do you know about that? Again, how can you find that out? This is not something people carry on their sleeves, right? So, but they might express it in some of the things you've heard them say or some of the ways in which they react. Oftentimes in our society, we don't overtly speak about our feelings, but we still act on them. We still act out. And so you can sometimes, by their angry, voices as they come up in public meetings, you can still hear what those emotions are behind them. I also want to say that emotions vary from moment to moment. I love this definition of emotion as energy in motion. We are not in the same place, and I don't need to explain that and spend much time on it. You know it about anything. You don't feel one thing only in a day. You feel many, many different things. And even about climate change, you probably felt many things over time. The same is true for other people. I guess what I want to impress on you is that oftentimes in our communication, particularly with a scientific issue like climate change, we spend a lot of time on the science side, on the logic, on the, giving people information, on the right hand, on the rational side of the brain, if you will. It's the left hemisphere, but it's the rational side. It's all about sort of, how things work in a very logical manner. The other side of our brain, the right hemisphere, is the one in which we think about things more holistically, and it's the affective side, the emotional side. It's where all our emotional expression, our creativity, our imagination comes from. So I want you to think about the fact that you are made up of 2 hemispheres. You have both, and everybody else you speak to, your audiences, has both. But you only often try to speak only to the side that's the rational side. I'm going to summarize for you a huge body of existing work that says simply this: when we to understand things, to memorize things, to evaluate a situation, and to make decisions, they're all better if we speak to both sides. This is not about rational decision making. This is about integrating our rational side with our emotional side. That's when we make the best decisions. That's when we understand things most deeply. That's when we memorize things in the most lasting way. Just think about your own life for a moment. Your biggest memories. I bet you $1,000 that those memories have a very strong emotional component. So, what I want you to think about is how can you, in your communication to the audience you're trying to reach, use both sides of the brain. Your own, your own creativity, your own emotion, your own passion, with everything you know technically about this issue, the rational side, and speak to both sides in the audience. Now, let's just, work through a little bit how to do that. So for example, if you wanted to tap this issue of people being interested, underneath that oftentimes is that they're interested in the things they care about, they love about, or they're grateful for. How do you tap that? Well, what I have found over time is if you can really get into people's curiosity, and stimulate that curiosity, speak to their natural propensity to want to know something, that really gets people's attention. So for example, I always find it surprising that people are more interested in how humans behave and think and tick and, than when you tell them how the climate behaves. An explanation of the climate is nowhere nearly as interesting to people as the curiosities about who we are as human beings. If you bring to them counterintuitive science, things that really just, mess with their brains, and it's like, what? That can really tap into there. So can you surprise your audience? Can you think of a way to tell them something that they just is completely counter what they expected? Sometimes people are really interested in how other species adapt, and it's important, and when you do that you don't undermine the ability to help other species adapt, right? So, but it's just a way in, right? Can you find out what would really intrigue someone to pay attention to what you have to say? Here's another one. I mentioned already, worry often is sort of a cover, if you will, for underlying love and for, grief about what we might be losing. So one place to tap into that is this local place-based impacts. Remember when I sent you out in the first unit to look at something that happens locally, and it brought out your worries, and it's because you love where you are. It's an amazingly beautiful place, and the discussion we had in this morning's Zoom meeting about people messing up the beaches when they party and don't pay attention, right? So those are ways in which you can engage actually something that people at the core of the emotion that they actually love about where you are. And the same with hope. We're going to talk a lot more about hope, but it's that desire to help make something better, the desire to work toward that common future, that common purpose that we talked about this morning. So we'll come back to this, but making things feasible, adding up, showing how if everyone does this, how it adds up to a significant impact. We so often can get lost when we only have, look at our own impact and it's like nothing. It's a global problem. What can I do? Well, but if you can help show to people that if everyone did that, it actually would, amount to something, then all of a sudden we feel like we're part of a bigger something. Now, what's important here is that you tap emotions, if you will, as a source of power. I'm pointing you here to the work of Joanna Macy, that is just amazing. If you don't know it, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. But oftentimes what she does is she begins with gratitude. She just says, what do you love? What do you love about this place? And then ask people to be present to how the thing that we love is threatened by climate change, by biodiversity loss, and then being with and paying attention to and honoring the pain that we feel when we imagine it being lost or when we witness it being lost. What's interesting is that when you do that and when you allow these emotions, it's not fun. They're not pleasant necessarily, but typically when you allow those emotions, then it actually frees up energy. Why? Because you're not spending the energy suppressing the emotion you have about how you feel about this thing that you love being threatened. So it actually frees up energy and you begin to see new possibilities and then actually feel the power to act on it. So it's a renewable energy is I guess what I'm trying to say here. And it's something that I strongly encourage you to consider including. And I also want to say oftentimes that means, if you're not able to deal with somebody else's emotion coming flying at you in a public meeting or in a conversation, it often is made easier to deal with that and to understand where people are coming from and to be empathetic with whatever emotional reactions they have if you have done your own emotional work. I really want to encourage you to spend time with what climate change means for you personally, deeply inside you, and be with that emotion. And then, simply through that own experience, be more empathetic with other people and understand that that's actually a really important part. Now, if you are in a position, whether it's in small group conversations with students or with kids or, in a community meeting or wherever it is, if you want to make space for emotions as opposed to just having them fly unconsciously around, I want to encourage you to only ever invite people and to give people a choice to express them, to not force them. It doesn't work. Emotion requires safety to be expressed. If you do that, and people do begin to share how they feel about what's happening on the planet, to authentically validate that what they're feeling is, that is a real experience. This is not just drama. This is real for people and for many people, and to in many ways normalize it. And what I mean by that is not to say this is, what we all should feel, but this is what many of us do feel. It's a shared experience across the globe. The work of Joanna Macy that I just mentioned, she has done it across the planet for the last 50 years of her life. And it's come to Africa, it's come to Asia, it's come to Europe, North America, South America. It's a shared human experience. And the reason probably is that we just love the one planet that we have to live on. So being present with that, witnessing and just listening, not trying to fix anything, but to be respectful around other people's emotion, it can just do wonders to a change in the conversation. So something to maybe consider as a part of your strategy. Now, I guess what this demands of us is that we accept what is happening without collapsing in despair. That's, you allow your emotion, your despair, your grief, anything, whatever it is that you feel about it. And from my own experience, I can tell you this is not something you do once and you're done. You do this again and again and again. But while images like the one you see here on this particular picture are true, this destruction and this wastefulness and atrocities that we commit, if you will, you also look outside the window and it's absolutely gorgeous. Both are true. And the task is that we hold the tension between these two ends of the spectrum of what's possible, namely the beauty is there and this destruction is there. And as we hold that tension and not fall into, on either side of it and deny the other side, I think we slowly come to accept that both are true and that the future is actually not made up. It's not finished. It's still open to be written. I want to, in this place here, just remind you of this absolutely gorgeous interview for today that Raymond did for us with Victor. the musician who speaks to, just this tension between the absolutely gorgeous environment that you all live in, and that there's also atrocities against that in your country, in your islands, in other countries around the world, everywhere that is true. So go to listen to that, and listen to his song. It, I think, really brings out for me this emotional paradox of where we're at. And so I want to invite you now to just be with what I just talked about, the transformative imperative and the challenges that this will involve, the task, the human task, the changes we have to deal with, and all that that brings up for us emotionally. I'm going to ask you, I want to invite you to write a letter. I want you in a moment to stop this video and to write a letter to someone you love who will live in this climate-altered future. Maybe they're already born. Maybe they will be born. Maybe it's even your own self when you're old. I want you to take time to write that letter, and when you're done, I want you to contact your training partner and just simply share your letter. Read it to them out loud, no discussion, no commentary, just being with. Just listening, and when you are the listener, at the end, just saying thank you. And with that, I'm going to release you from this particular part 1 of Unit 3 to let you write your letter. And then you can come back after your exercise is complete to part 2.